Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Brady Andreessen in our Office of Technology at ONC, and I'm excited to bring you this session full of acronyms. We are going to be talking about advancing interoperability through the USCDI, the Standards Version Advancement Process, or SVAP, as well as some updates on US FHIR core. We have a great panel joining us today. We have Christina Carballo from Audacious Inquiry, as well as Terry O'Malley from Mass General and Partners. They're going to be giving us an update on from the USCDI task force. We have ONC's Al Taylor and Rob Anthony, who are going to be covering some updates around the USCDI, as well as the Standards Version Advancement Process. And then Brett Marquard, who is going to be giving us an update on US FHIR core, as well as the USCDI and how they relate. And then we are going to save some time to have some Q&A with you all. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Terry and Christina to walk through their content and give us some updates and information around the Health IT Advisory Committee USCDI task force work that they have been doing. Terry, Christina.
Good morning, Brett. Christina may be having a little audio problem, but let me start off by saying we're delighted to be here and share with you how we got to the on-deck process, which is ONC's new way of getting data elements and data classes advanced to and through USCDI. Really a remarkable piece of work on behalf of ONC. And Christina and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about how we got to where we got. Starting off, just briefly, we had a USCDI task force made up of many folks, and they met often and created about 45 recommendations for ONC. In order to design the delivery process. And what we had in this process, it was really a job of balancing sort of the need for getting as many people interested and involved in promoting data elements and data classes, and yet balancing it off against a bunch of other issues. So the trade-offs, we wanted to create a process that really was barrier-free, that if you had a data element or data class that you thought was important for the country, then you should feel free to submit it. But we also knew that in order to get through that process, there had to be a very, very rigorous maturation process for the data elements. They had to be ready to go and be implemented nationwide at the time that they got to USCDI. So there's this balance between get everyone in, but only a few are going to get out because of the maturation. So you also have to balance this need for testing, which we understood would really limit the number of data elements that got through USCDI, and yet there's interoperability just needs many more data elements than USCDI will ever be able to produce. And again, the important piece of USCDI is that now it becomes part of certification. So if then the data element gets into USCDI, it becomes a requirement for EHR certification. So there's a lot riding on getting as much into USCDI as we can, but understanding that there's a balance between what we need and how well it can be adopted. So let me check back with Christina and see if she's with us.
Can you guys hear me now?
Great.
Sorry about that. And thank you, Terry.
No problem.
The mute button. Wonderful. So thanks for kicking us off. Yes. So I just wanted to give a little background on kind of the high tax process for our strategy and hope for outcomes when we were coming up with our recommendations for ONC. And when we thought through what we wanted, we have the wonderful privilege of being able to create a ton of recommendations, and that's probably what we're really good at, is putting a lot of our wish list out. And I will say that with ONC's on deck, which we're going to see a little bit more of from Al today, I think our whole task force was just overwhelmed with joy on how amazing ONC really captured the goals and what we were trying to achieve and hope for through the recommendations that we gave with the high tech. It really was above and beyond. I'm personally really excited about On Deck. So just to give a little background on kind of the really big core things that we cared most about when we were thinking about how we move data elements and data classes through the process to get through USCDI. One of the big things that was really important was to have a very open submission process. This is something that anyone could join and submit data classes and data elements of interest. It was extremely important to the task force to be able to establish communities of interest to rally around the data elements and data classes to get them through the USCDI process and really ready for national exchange, really looking at that data perfection, as I like to say, once you kind of get through the USCDI process. So again, it was really, really important to create a platform that facilitated collaboration and required the data element to be really tested and promoted through the process and ready. Through this desire to make it so that we had communities of interest be able to rally behind data elements despite their technical knowledge, we thought it was really important to create a user guide or a checklist so that the milestones to get through the process were very clearly defined. You understand as a community of interest or an individual really pushing and driving a data element to go through the USCDI process, what you needed to do next. So those clear milestones and really a shortened process. Whether you're in USCDI or not, once you get to the top of level 2, it's really saying, you know, you're ready, you're vetted, you've jumped through all the hoops, and you're really kind of on deck. So our outcomes were really to provide advance notice for data elements that were quote unquote on deck. We love ONC's clever acronym with the on deck submission, which is you'll hear more about from Al later. We really hoped to be able to encourage development of data elements to really be ready at that top of level 2. I know everyone's probably super excited and eager to submit data elements as we're talking. I know Alan and Brett are probably eagerly awaiting for them to come through. But really looking at how we can get through the process of USCDI to kind of be ready, constantly thinking through this process, how we're very strategic about evaluating data elements to be able to get the high priority ones ready for national deployment while limiting burden to implement them from developers before they become regulatory required. So with that, I am going to do a quick intervention from our sponsor that Terry O'Malley is going to transition to.
Okay, so the task force was so enthusiastic about USCDI that we decided to set up a website, onc.com, to push USCDI merchandise. So we tried this bumper sticker out in DC, and it's amazing how many cab drivers honked. You wouldn't recognize the huge fan base USCDI has. So it makes us want to think that we should expand into hats and t-shirts and ashtrays, but we digress. So let's go on to sort of the model itself. And is there a way of making this slide bigger? I'm sorry. It looks like it's coming out a little bit small. This is the promotion model. And what we did is we set it up like a user's guide. We wanted to make it very clear to anyone who wanted to submit data elements or classes that this was the list of items that they had to check off in their quest to get their data element into USCDI. So we wanted them to know exactly what they had to do. So I'm going to walk you through the grid. So the blue column, let's see, there we go. The blue column just has the levels, and data elements initially are registered as comments, and they then progress based on which milestones they have met. So you could come into the process as a comment, be reviewed by ONC, and if you have already been deployed in production in multiple platforms, you might go directly to level 2 without passing through level 1. But most folks are going to go through this progression of data elements. So the next column is just sort of broadly speaking what happens in each of these phases. So going from comment to level 2, it's really just an ongoing process of maturation, specification, and broadening the base of support behind the data element. And finally, the review to get you into USCDI occurs at the level of ONC and the Health Information Technology Advisory Committee. So going through the comments period, here's an example of sort of the things that you need to go through. We wanted to set a very low bar, requiring only a reason for a national exchange and a reasonable use case. And as you go up the list of milestones, the data elements require more specification linked to widely adopted standards. The goal is to encourage submissions, get as many communities of interest as possible engaged, but then require existing specification testing and maturity before advancing to become a national standard. And this, once you sufficiently specified a data element, the path out of the comment level to level 1 is through testing and connectathons, and finally production in a limited number of settings. But to be considered for USCDI and to get to level 2, you really need to be deployed in production on the majority of platforms that exist. Not every platform, but sufficient to make it clear that national adoption would not be a big lift once the data element gets to this point. And the final phase is the high-TAC ONC review, and that's the determination of sort of the trade-offs between the costs and the benefits of adding a data element to USCDI to make sure that there's sufficient capacity to do it. So importantly, the data elements can advance as quickly as possible and go from comment to level 2 in one cycle if they've met the requirements. So before I pass this on to Altair, let me just say again, repeat what Christina said. The task force was just absolutely blown away by the remarkable job that ONC did in capturing not only the details, but also the philosophy behind the USCDI promotion. So kudos, they did an absolutely outstanding job. So Al, you're on.
Thanks, Terry. So as everybody knows, ONC published the first version of the United States Core Data for Interoperability, USCDI, We published it on our website in March, and it became published in the Federal Register in June. USCDI is comprised of a set of granular data elements that we feel like is the minimum, sort of the minimum bar or the minimum amount of clinical data related to a patient that needs to be gathered in an EHR and exchanged between EHRs and other health IT. It came through the proposal and rulemaking process. We developed and refined this set along with a lot of input from the HITAC, quite a bit, not just the process to advance the version, but the process to actually define the initial set. We have the USCDI now has a new look and feel on our website at healthit.gov/USCDI. It shows not only the current, this is a fragment of the version 1 that's presented on the web page. It is comprised of data classes, which are depicted by the tiles. And within each data class, there are granular data elements, which is the minimum, is the sort of the lowest common denominator, lowest element of a clinical concept that must be able to be captured and exchanged. So to take a look at this, you can either look at the document, the PDF to get a better idea about what standards are associated with some of these data classes and data elements, or you can drill down into each of the data classes and data elements here on the website. ONC never intended for this to be a permanent standard or a standard set of data. We intentionally developed a process, again with coordination and collaboration with the HITAC, to get public stakeholder input on what should be added to the USCDI or what should be changed in the USCDI. And as a result of that, we've put together the USCDI version update process. And we have a website. Called On Deck, which it stands for the ONC Data Element and Class Submission System. So for stakeholders who are interested in making recommendations or suggestions for new data elements, this is run through the Interoperability Standards Advisory platform, and it requires an account to put in a submission. You can review it without an account, but in order to make a comment or to make a recommendation to add new data elements, an account is required for the ISA. So the first thing that happens in this system is that a new data element is submitted. We request, in many cases, we require certain elements of description of the data elements so that we can get a better idea about how mature, how ready, how feasible a data element is for addition to USCDI. Once we get the submission intact, after we've gathered any additional information required from the submitter, we make a determination as to how ready this new data element is for addition to the USCDI, and we've broken it down into these 3 levels of comment level 1 and the most mature, most ready level 2. Once we have made that determination, we post this on our website, which is, like I said, it's a part of the ISA, and it will be. We're going to go back to this slide. Once the new data element is determined, the level is determined, it'll be placed into one of these 3 levels, one comment level 1 or level 2. And within that posting of the data element, you will see some additional. This will be the information that was submitted through the system. You'll be able to drill down into the actual data element and find out all the information that was submitted. This is our first submission. It is related to ophthalmic data. and there's several others that are being submitted. They're still being evaluated. So this is just a sample, but it's a real sample of a submission, and it includes specific information about the submission, and which would help us determine if it's ready and if the use case is significant enough and the impact on users is significant enough to add this to the next version of USCDI. This data element is currently rated at or leveled at a comment, but with additional work, we may be able to come up with. The idea is that anybody, including the submitter or the general public, can go in and make comments, make additions and contributions to this work to advance these data elements for consideration for USCDI. The USCDI process, as far as a life cycle goes, this is that we intend to update the USCDI on an annual basis. We're currently in the submission and review process where the on-deck system is open. In fact, the on-deck system will be open continuously, but we have to set a cutoff to evaluate all submissions that have come in. And this year we have the cutoff for submissions being about the 9th of October is our current published deadline for submissions. Once we get all of the submissions, we will make considerations for each of these data elements that have achieved this level 2 as far as maturity and readiness. We will then put together a draft version 2, which we will then present back to the HITAC in January at the same time as we publish the draft version 2 on the USCDI website, which I showed you earlier. Anybody can go in and review it, make comments on it as a whole, make comments on individual data elements if you prefer. And this public comment period, including HITAC evaluation, will take about 4 months. At which point we'll close it out like we do with our proposed rulemaking process as well. We, after an adequate period of public comment, we'll close down the comment and then go back to work in ONC and determine which of the comments need to be integrated, which of the data elements need to be added, and which of the data elements need to be removed from consideration. Around the 1st of next year, we should see our second version of the USCDI be published. The national coordinator will approve that second version, the version 2. But the process doesn't quite stop there. Once we have a new version of USCDI, just like if we have a new version of any other standard that is out there. For example, we currently are in FHIR 4, and at some point in the future we'll be at FHIR 5. ONC will determine whether or not those new versions, including USCDI version 2, can be available through a process called the Standards Version Advancement process. The SVAP will allow health IT developers to update their system and update their systems to these new versions, at which point, Rob Anthony is going to talk a little bit about the connection between SVAP and certification for health IT. But this new version in the SVAP will be able to be integrated into systems, and systems can then claim to be updated to the new version of USCDI without having to go through an additional certification process or another pass through the certification bodies. During this period, which we're about to begin, any standards that are currently updated from where they were in the most recent certification, system, if there's been an update to any of these versions, those will be also considered for addition to the list of eligible standards that can be updated in health IT. We do have the website, healthit.gov/SVAP. If you want to go in, and it's a work in progress, but you will be able to go in and see which versions, which standards have been updated recently or more recent than the last regulation, and which of them are being considered for addition for voluntary updates. Our intention is to have a public comment period at the end of the, again, similar to the USCDI submission period. There'll be a period of time during which versions that are updated and being considered for addition to USCDI, I'm sorry, considered for addition to the list of SVAP versions. There'll be a comment period on which of those that we're considering actually should be added to the SVAP list for voluntary updates. And once that SVAP list is finalized, again, by the national coordinator, and we have developed test methods, which Rob will talk about, then systems can test and update their systems to these new versions, in addition, including but certainly not limited to USCDI. I'm going to pass it off now to Rob to talk a little bit more about the SVAP. Rob?
Thanks, Al. I'm Rob Anthony. I'm the director of the ONC Health IT Certification Program, and just wanted to talk a little bit about SVAP from the certification side. Al covered a little bit of this. Obviously, the standards version advancement process was a response to, I think, what we had heard for a number of years, that there were times and instances in which the certification process and the certification requirements could be a potential limiting factor in trying to move to new versions of standards or implementation specs that would allow the industry to move forward. And a lot of that is tied to the rulemaking cycle that we actually have implementing as far as the certification requirements. So the SVAP was sort of born of that. It is a voluntary process that allows developers to move on to an approved advanced version of a particular standard and implementation spec. Within the regulation that we published, the ONC Cures Act final rule, it is specifically tied to the real world testing condition of certification. So the SVAP page that Al displayed earlier lists the specific certification criteria that are eligible for that advancement process. And you can go and consult that, but generally real world testing centers around, excuse my regulatory shorthand, but what we call the B criteria, which are usually specific functionalities related to certification, like transitions of care or e-prescribing. The C criteria 1 through 3, which are related to clinical quality measures. E1, which is view, download, transmit. The F criteria, which are public health reporting. The G criteria 7 through 10, which are around API criteria, and H, which is around the direct transport criteria. So all of those are eligible for a potential advanced version to be approved. Again, it is a voluntary process for developers that allows them to move forward, and it is something of an indication of what versions are likely to be adopted in the next official version of or official edition of certification. The way that this will work, and we outline this within the regulation, and there will be some additional information about this, but once a version is actually developed, approved by the national coordinator and made available for adoption, a developer has the option to move ahead either if they have a previously certified product with that particular advanced version available, or if you are brand new and coming in, you could move immediately to the new version that is available. You would need to provide notice to any of your affected customers if you are a previously certified health IT developer, letting them know that you are planning to update to that more advanced version of the standard, and how that is going to affect the health IT module that is certified and interoperability in general, whether you intend to continue to provide support for the existing version or for how long, what that might look like. You would need to let your ACB know that as well. You're a certification body. And then you will have to demonstrate conformance to the new approved version. Sometimes that will be through an available test tool, if that is developed in time. Other times it may be through an immediate demonstration of attestation through your ACB. And ultimately, everybody will have to incorporate those SVAP versions into their real-world testing plan to demonstrate that in a real-world testing environment, a deployment environment, that they meet and conform to all of the standards requirements for that particular version. There's going to be some more information that is released on that page about the SVAP process, what the timeline looks like, what the public comment and engagement process looks like. So would encourage people to visit that page and take a look at things regularly. We'll be releasing some information soon on that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brett Marquardt.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, I like calling it the different letter criteria. I will, I've always thought about how important the G criteria is, but now I'll think about all the other letters too, and what they tie to. So up next, how does this relate? We had talked about USCDI and the advancement process, and how does this tie into some of the specifications that are out there? And so I'm talking specifically about HL7 FHIR. So in the HL7 community, we've developed an implementation guide called the FHIR Core. And the intention of this implementation guide is it's a subset. Oops, I'm getting a note that folks can't hear me. Just a second. Oh, someone says they can hear me. Okay, it's a labeled subset that of all kind of HL7 US realm produced FHIR profiles. So it's not all HL7 US realm profiles. It's a subset, and it's a key subset that has received a certain amount of testing within the HL7 community. The idea is that this subset can be a baseline for other implementation guides. So the DaVinci project, Codex, different accelerators can pick up and reuse these and constrain them further to meet their use cases. But we know as kind of within an industry, there's a common understanding that folks are going to support these particular profiles. They have been validated through HL7. And it's important to note that, for folks who've spent a lot of time looking at the Argonaut community, the original Argonaut guide based on FHIR DSQ2, the FHIR Core incorporates those lessons learned, search criteria, some of the examples from there, conformance requirements, has baked it into this FHIR Core guide. And in terms of how it relates to CDI, FHIR Core is intended to have guidance for all of the CDI data elements and data classes. So we did just do an update here. Let me click on the next slide here. There was an update last fall. So it was influenced by USCDI. We added guidance for clinical notes. We added the new pediatric vital signs and a whole bunch of guidance on provenance. And for folks, when you dig into here, you'll see both a formal FHIR profile, which has a set of rules and constraints on exactly which elements should be present, vocabulary that goes with it. But then also within clinical notes and provenance and medications, there's a whole kind of separate section in the guide for guidance to help kind of not just have the hard and fast rules, but give some of the thinking behind how clinical notes may exist in EHR systems. Some EHRs they may have gotten paper copies and have scanned them in as PDFs, and how different EHRs may index that information to try to give new client app developers guidance on how they'll find that information. So this was published last November. Just a quick comparison for folks to see the Argonaut DSQ2 versus US core profiles. For some reason, it's not highlighting. If you look closely, there is bold here, and maybe if you get the slides, the yellow will show up. But it is bigger. So the DSQ2 from Argonaut grew into a larger version, and FHIR Core, which is considered release 3.1 right now. And you can see the additional profiles influenced by USCDI. I couldn't help but put one little screenshot of a FHIR profile in here. So this is a US Core profile on condition. And if you look closely at it, you'll see that there is a set of 6 elements that our systems must support. You can look and see cardinality, where there's a few 1.1 or 1.*, which means they're mandatory. Systems got to always populate those. You can see some vocabulary constraints on the far right, but this is folks or even non-developers. As you poke into the spec, it's intended to be readable by all, and we do our best. We know sometimes it's a bit technical in verbiage, but there is some introductory prose to help kind of guide folks through it. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, what's the mapping for US Core to USCDI? Someone asked, where's the authority? Someone asked me yesterday, what's the authoritative mapping? And there isn't a quote ONC or industry. This is the mapping for USCDI to FHIR. But there is a really good one in the US Core specification, and I would call it the mapping. It's been validated several times by HL7, and it takes the latest USCDI elements, maps it to the US Core profiles, and with the idea that will help developers who are trying to meet some of the certification criteria. Additionally, in the spec, there's a whole bunch of terminology. So all the value sets that are to support US FHIR Core are included in the specification. And also, just kind of hot off the presses, we're not quite over the final hurdle, but we're darn close. The US Core FHIR Core errata is pending. Of course, when ONC did their errata release this summer, we had to make a few updates. But frankly, we had a few of our own errata already piled up in May. And myself and a colleague, Eric Haas, around with a whole pretty large community of folks, poured some energy in to get this out the door. It's really interesting, and I'm sure folks who published the specification have experienced this, but for those who haven't, we started this with about, maybe 15 or 20 things we wanted to fix, and by the time we were done, we had 45 of things people had brought up, mostly minor tweaks, but a few, we didn't actually have the circumference percentile profile in the spec, and so that was one that we had to add. All the changes have been applied. There is a public website with the changes applied, but it's not officially been published by HL7. It will be 3.1.1, and I expect it will be up there quite soon. We have a little bit of ballot work going on at HL7, so there's some work to get those publications up and running, but this will be published very soon for folks who are planning to implement the US FHIR Core. So one of the tricky things about, we're in this presentation saying, hey, here's how you do USCDI and US FHIR Core. So, and I feel like I'm coming after this incredible, ONC, this very thoughtful on deck process, and the thought of how does this relate to US FHIR Core? How do we respond? And I think what's been interesting is the first thing is US FHIR Core does not directly equal the ONC USCDI. They're on a different publication schedule. US Core is not restricted to what's in the ONC USCDI. Like, we can add other things to it if there's a strong case for it. And so, so first off, we know they don't equal each other. So the question is, is US Core bigger than ONC USCDI? And at times, HL7 will say this. Yeah, we have a few profiles in there, location, organization, that have not come up quite in USCDI or by ONC. And so HL7 could say this. At other times, ONC could say, hey, guess what? USCDI is bigger than US Core because we've published a new version. We've made some changes, or even maybe USCDI from ONC is a little bit more important, you could say, because there's some maybe regulatory authority behind it at times. But the way I've settled this, and I think starts to make sense, I'm happy to take feedback on this, is I feel like we're kind of in this continuous game of a little bit of leapfrog. There is coordination with ONC giving feedback, but until it's published and locked in, it's tricky to make an update to a standard. And so, at times, ONC and USCDI can be a little bit ahead, and at other times, US Core will catch up and maybe leap ahead and add some new functionality. And so the question that may be on your mind is, okay, so how do you grow US FHIR Core? And I think, we have this kind of light proposed process, HL7. It's not formalized yet, but I think hearing ONC's, very clear, here's where we're going to publish USCDI, here's the on-deck process of how things, it's something for HL7 to shoot for. And I think maybe, in the months ahead, if you want to influence that at the U.S. Home Steering Committee, Steve Posnack, I think it's an opportunity for us to improve our own process. But here's kind of the way we've been thinking about it, at least, so you can get a sense of where we were headed. Is that, to get into the HL7 US FHIR core, we want folks to say, hey, I have a very important data element, that, our class of elements that I think should be included in kind of this base specification for all EHR, other health information systems support. And so we said, all right, that's great. Let us know, get it published, and pilot it. The idea of US core is we want to be very careful about putting kind of provisional data elements that don't have broad industry adoption and understanding. We'd like them to be piloted, we'd like them to be tested, and even baked into several systems before we add them to the spec. Partially that's just because it is a fair bit of effort to add things to a spec, but the effort's not the big deal. The idea is we want industry consensus around it kind of being a core element for other people to build on. I mean, if it's very specific to public health and other people aren't going to build on it, that's great. Publish it in Public Health Guide. Maybe reuse a piece of US core. But if it's not broadly applicable to other use cases, then maybe it doesn't, its home may not be in US core. So something we're trying to iron out. But the idea is, it's something the industry understands and many systems support. And eventually, propose to the steering committee HL7 and do a formal ballot and update the specification. And I think the idea of, there's several communities out there already that do a really nice job of supporting, or you can create a law. If you're ONC, if you find a new data element, it works through the on-deck process and it becomes a regulatory requirement, it's going to get added to US core. So clearly that's one way to jump over the process. But the communities that are out there, Argonaut, other accelerator communities, can really help kind of move through that the publishing and the testing and the connectathon work before adding it. So. We're on this journey together. It's really nice to see the effort of ONC to define how they're going to grow USCDI. I think there's a little bit of work at HL7 to do something kind of complementary to that. I mean, we don't actually, as of this moment, I'll be honest, we don't have a formal US core is going to be updated on this release cycle every 6 months, or there's a lag from when ONC publishes USCDI to US core. But now that there's a clear time frame in ONC, I think that that's something I plan to bring up at HL7 of let's define the release cycle of US core so the industry can plan. So when the draft is out, how HL7 responds. So with that, I'll move to questions.
Thanks, Brett. And I think all of us at ONC would, and maybe others in the industry would agree that if only creating a law was that fast, quick and easy to just slide right over, we would save ourselves a lot of time. So a number of questions have been coming into the chat. I'm going to do my best to kind of tee them up. There's been a few questions around kind of what level 2 adoption looks like. I'm going to ask maybe Al or maybe others if you want to chime in as well. Just kind of, can you define, adoption for level 2? Is it maybe by, the system itself or by footprint, like patient coverage? Just can you speak more, maybe Al, to what some of the different requirements for the levels actually are?
Sure. So the determination for levels is based on combination of subjective and objective criteria. And there was a question about, is this is a cart before the horse or chicken before the egg? Is it already used enough to be added to USCDI, or does it need to be developed first? It's more testing, more pilots, et cetera, need to be to prove that it's worthy of addition. And it needs to be, it's something that has to, a level 2 data element would have to be something that needs to be able to be exchanged. It could already be exchanged in pilots or in limited sites, including used and accessed and exchanged in a variety of different clinical sites, or it could at least have the potential. And that potential, the ability to, the technical ability to exchange those data elements is one thing. The reasons that might need to exchange those data elements are another, and it's where the reasons, the importance or the value of being able to exchange those data elements It's when that more subjective measurement is evaluated and found to be, if this is important enough for everybody to be using and exchanging this data element, then it's a strong candidate for addition to USCDI. We need to be able to demonstrate that at a minimum it can be exchanged. It doesn't already have to be in widespread use, but there are some things that are in widespread use that are not part of USCDI, and that might be considered in the future. I don't quite know. I think I answered the question, but because some of that, the value is more subjective or somewhat more subjective. It's a little bit hard to, put a numerical score on something and say, it's got a high enough score to be considered as a level 2 or a future USCDI data element.
Got it. Thanks, Al. A couple questions here I'm going to tee up for Brett. Some ONC USCDI data elements don't have associated standards listed for them, and the question is whether all FHIR US core elements have associated standards for them. And then there was a question around should organizations submit for updates.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll take, so the first one is, USCDI data elements don't have associated standards. So I believe, at this time, if there's a USCDI data element, US Core covers the current version of USCDI as published. And if for some reason you find something that we missed, we make mistakes, please log a tracker at HL7, or you can email me if you don't know that process, and I'm happy to help kind of work through that. But the idea right now, as of this moment in time today, US FHIR Core should have guidance for all of the current USCDI elements. In terms of, for folks who have new data elements, should you submit them to USCDI, to ONC first, or HL7 first, or how, what's the right dance there? That's a great question. I think I definitely would submit them to ONC, because ONC is definitely the gorilla in the, I don't know what the term is. They're if they agree with it that's important, it's going to go everywhere. So I would definitely encourage submission to ONC. But the conversation at HL7 and US FHIR Core is important also. And so, developing kind of formalization of how that data element or class will be exchanged and doing some testing, that's an incredible helpful thing and could then be folded in. So, it's not going to hurt to do both in parallel.
Awesome, thanks. Al, do you want to maybe walk us through like a use case kind of through the entire process, and maybe Brett, you could kind of chime in after it leaves the ONC side of the house, so to speak. So there was an example, data standards for e-prescribing, those data elements and those standards have largely been wide adopted, but medications now really only has SNOMED listed versus NCPDB having NDC to express medication. So would it be reasonable to believe that would be added to USCDI? And are there other standards that might be added as well?
Well, so I'm kind of going. I'm just reading this question. So medications is a concept. In the USCDI data class of medications is a concept of representing medication that belongs to the patient, and it doesn't get into the details necessarily about date prescribed, date dispensed, date taken, last dose. But it just says that it's a minimum. It's like I said, it's a minimum standard to represent. The standard associated with medications is RX norm, but that's NCPDB script is a prescription standard, not a medication standard. So it's the act of ordering and filling a medication. That's different. That's a process associated with medication, not the medication itself that belongs to the patient in some way. And so if we wanted to keep it at a higher level of representing the concept of medication, without getting too specific, it says that you must also include specific data elements such as prescribed date or last dose or something along those lines. So it's not necessarily, it could be something that's proposed as an additional data element for medications. But we are trying to keep it at a sort of minimum required concept for patient data.
Okay, let's look at some of the other questions here. Rob, do you want to maybe talk about, so there was a question around coming from public health around, how would public health or other stakeholders review or approve any potential changes to standards and in F, kind of going back to the specific certification criteria?
Yeah, I think I can speak to it generally. We have not yet released for all of ONC an overview of what the timeline and the public comment process will look like for SVAP, but I think we're following broadly the same type of model of what we are doing with USCDI, where there'll be a time for public comment on particular standards, a time to nominate some particular things. Obviously, we are building on standards that are available, new versions of standards that are currently available to current criteria. So it wouldn't be an entirely new standard, it would be a new version. This is a standard version advancement process, and there should be a possibility for all stakeholders, including public health, to comment on nominated standards in that area.
Got it. Good. This one I'm going to kick back to Brett. So are there, similar to, testing sites that are available for CCDA, are there testing sites for FHIR available so that vendors can test use cases and obtain feedback during development?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Yeah, the certification for the API criterion and FHIR is on its way with the platform Inferno that MITRE's released. So if you haven't checked out Inferno, there's a few presentations that probably are recorded if you haven't had a chance to attend all the sessions at Tech Forum. But that toolkit includes both kind of a certification edition, which will go straight through the ONC requirements, and a community edition, which allows you to kind of include additional implementation guides. And also what's really neat is the Inferno team built in an instance validator. So if you're used to kind of the CCDA or site, or kind of different ability to kind of upload your own document to validate whether it's good or not, they've created a little web form where you can actually paste an instance and hit validate, and it'll tell you whether it's good or not. And so it's out there. Check out Inferno.
Awesome. And then I'm going to kick one more over to you, Brett, too. So will the 807 and FHIR community at least be able to monitor what's coming in through the USCDI pipeline, data elements and comment phase, kind of moving through the maturation levels? And, how is the FHIR community and HL7 involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think On Deck is about 3 weeks old, maybe officially, in terms of how far it's out there. So we haven't had a full reaction to it, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's anything where people are being public and open about, where ONC is headed, helps HL7 respond, and not HL7, the broader community respond to do testing. So absolutely, that'd be something we'll be watching going forward.
Okay. So another question, and this might be for Al or Terry and Christina, if you want to chime in on this at all too, it might be interesting to hear your thoughts. With respect to strategic importance in between, clinical, consumer, payers, research, et cetera, how are use cases considered higher value than simply one category or use?
I want to take a crack at this first, and then if Terry or Christina want to chime in as well from the public and high tech, public and advisory committee perspective. So it's not, ONC itself is not the only source of the value associated with the potential, a potential new data element. We have our own internal process in rating this on somewhat of an objective scale, to talk about feasibility, to evaluate for standards readiness, technical readiness. But the determination of the use case, it could be made by the submitter itself. And it could very clearly demonstrate that this particular new data element should be widely used by the vast majority of health IT users. Without speculating, that is something that the submitter may very well be able to provide. However, they may only have an idea about their own particular use case, and it may, through public comment, it may come out that there's other significant other use cases for the use of this data element, and it becomes very clear that this idea, although starting small, might actually be extremely valuable for a lot of different users in a lot of different settings. So it's going to be, to a large extent, it's going to be the public that is going to weigh in and contribute to the knowledge of what this use case value is.
Yeah, and this is Terry. If I could chime in, Al, I think that's exactly the case, and OnDeck is going to serve that sort of political purpose of galvanizing a community of interest and articulating the value of a particular data class or data elements becomes part of the process of getting it advanced. So it's more than chicken and egg. It's really sort of building on itself. In the task force, when we were discussing this, it really is a conundrum to know just how do you rank strategic value? Is there a national IT strategy? Is it, where's the input coming to make that strategy? Who's going to decide what elements get advanced over other elements if too many get in the queue? So these are all issues that are going to have to be sorted out over time. But I think the public process that OnDeck has put into place really becomes the key element in advancing the nation's strategic interests.
And just to add to that, when we were looking at the evaluation within the HITAC, we actually talked quite extensively about this, like how do you define the value? And we looked at the quadruple aim of healthcare, which is actually in the submission process kind of reworked in the OnDeck, looking at just the overall how you're improving patient experiences, looking at improving population health, reducing the cost of care, and improving the provider experience of care. But I think that when I think of USCDI, and this is kind of my personal hat on the process, the most important thing is that we're really taking these, enabling communities of interest to get behind a data element and push them through the process and say, these are ready. We've tested them in the standards world. We've tested them in real world testing. We've vetted these, we've got interest, they are of value to someone. And whether they're regulatory required or not, we've almost got like this process to get data perfection that anybody can go through. And then if it's USCDI or it's not USCDI, others within the industry have, or different stakeholders or different regulatory groups have the ability to point to USCDI level 2, top of the pyramid data elements and say, these are ready, let's get them implemented. And that's kind of almost decouples from regulation. I think that's really important. You're really going through a vetting process.
Great, thanks, Christina. And maybe I think we maybe just have time for maybe one quick answer left, and then we have to wrap up. First of all, the sessions will be available after recording, and we will have slides made available. And I'm getting a reminder here that we are close to wrapping up, and the session will cut off automatically. So we probably don't have time to answer any more questions, but I will. I just saved a copy of them all so we can try to follow up with folks that did have specific questions. So I just want to thank all of the panelists again for joining us today and talking through this. After lunch, we are going to be kind of looking at the future side of this. So looking at the resource, continuing the conversation that we had today, and looking where USCDI and other work is going in the future. And then we will also be talking later about integrating clinical and administrative information. So lots of great panels left, and we are pleased to offer you the same lunch that we would have been offering in person when we were meeting together. So enjoy that, and thank you all again for joining, and thanks to the panelists.
Thank you. There will now be a 1 hour and 15-minute lunch break. Please join the working session starting at 1:15 Eastern. Thank you.
Yeah.